Welcome to our deep dive into the privatization of Thames Water.
Oh, yeah.
It happened way back in 1989, but we're going to tackle a question with ripples that reach into today.
Okay.
Was it a success? A failure somewhere in between?
Yeah.
You've handed us a stack of documents to work with, prospectuses, financial reports.
All right.
It's like we've got a time machine
Right.
to that pivotal moment.
And it's a fascinating journey, not just for the water industry,
Right.
but for anyone who's ever turned on a tap or flushed a toilet in London.
Yeah.
This is the story of how a government took a huge essential service and put it into private hands.
Right, because we're talking about millions of people
Yes.
relying on Thames Water every single day.
Absolutely.
So before we jump to the privatization itself, let's paint a picture of what Thames Water looked like before the big change.
It was the largest of the 10 water service companies in England and Wales back then.
Wow.
A giant, even among giants.
Really?
Imagine the scale.
Okay.
Supplying water to 3.1 million premises. Collecting sewage from 4.9 million?
Wow.
That's over 11 million people, depending on them.
And it's not just any region. This is
Right.
Greater London we're talking about, the heart of it all.
The heart of it all.
So much riding on Thames Water, getting things right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And their work was intimately tied to the River Thames itself. Think about it.
Okay.
The Thames was both their primary water source and where the treated wastewater ended up.
Oh, wow.
So the health of the river was critical.
Right.
And that created a delicate balancing act.
Now, I love digging through old documents.
Oh, yeah.
And this prospectus prepared for potential investors back in '89 doesn't hold back.
Right.
Even before privatization.
Yeah,
Thames Water had its fair share of issues.
they did.
It paints a picture of a company struggling to keep up.
Yes. The need for major investment is a recurring theme throughout the prospectus. They had this ambitious plan
Okay.
called the K Investment Program.
Okay.
Get ready for this number.
All right.
It was estimated to cost £3.81 billion over 10 years.
Whoa.
That gives you a sense of the scale of the challenges they were facing.
That's a lot of money,
It is.
even by today's standards.
It is.
So what were the main problems they were trying to fix?
Well, a lot of it boils down to aging infrastructure.
Okay.
You see, they were losing a whopping 25% of treated water
What?
through leaky pipes.
Oh, my gosh.
Think about all that precious water just disappearing underground.
Wow, that's not just inefficient.
No.
It's almost criminal.
Yeah.
Especially with the growing population.
Right.
You would think they'd have tackled that
You'd think so.
before things got so bad.
You would.
Yeah.
But it gets worse.
Oh, no.
They also had water pressure issues in certain areas,
Okay.
particularly in London.
Hmm.
Imagine trying to get through a morning routine with barely a trickle coming out of your tap.
Right.
It was making it hard for them to meet demand,
Yeah.
even with all that water they were treating.
Right.
And then there's this whole issue with the clay cores in some of their reservoirs.
Clay cores. I have to admit that one's new to me.
Okay.
What's the issue there?
Some of these cores were showing signs of softening, which is not a good thing.
Right.
If the problem turned out to be widespread,
Yeah.
it could have meant a massive and incredibly expensive repair job.
Oh, wow.
And to add to the uncertainty, the prospectus mentions that investigations were still ongoing.
Oh, no.
Even they didn't know the full extent of the problem.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
We've got leaky pipes,
Yep.
water pressure woes, and potentially unstable reservoir.
That's right.
Sounds like they were trying to hold back a flood of problems.
Yeah.
Literally. Forget about water quality, too.
Oh, that's right.
Now, the prospectus says they were generally compliant with the regulations at the time, but there were some pretty specific areas of concern.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling these might resonate with you,
Okay.
given some of the headlines we've seen over the years.
All right.
Okay, I'm all ears.
All right.
Give me the dirt, so to speak.
Well, for starters, certain pesticides were showing up in the water supply at levels exceeding the permitted limits.
Oh, no.
Then there's Cryptosporidia,
Okay.
a microscopic parasite
Uh-huh.
that can cause quite a nasty illness.
Right.
It had been detected in some areas, raising concerns about public health.
Yikes.
Yeah.
That's definitely not what you want in your drinking water.
No, it's not.
Definitely not.
And then there's the issue of lead.
Oh.
The prospectus talks about the need to address areas where lead concentrations in the water might become a problem.
Right.
It's interesting because they also mentioned that a new, stricter sampling regime was coming online. Meaning they knew it was very likely they would find even more instances of non-compliance. The prospectus talks about things called relaxations and Section 20 undertakings,
Okay.
which basically allowed them to operate outside the rules temporarily while working towards compliance.
So kind of like a grace period to fix things up, I guess.
Yes.
But I'm sensing a bit of a pattern here.
Okay.
Find a problem, scramble to fix it.
Right.
Was this just a case of playing catch-up?
Mm.
Or were there deeper issues at play?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And to answer it, we need to delve into the other side of the equation,
Okay.
the sewage system.
Oh, right.
Because if the water supply side was struggling,
Right.
the sewage situation was, let's just say it was a whole other can of worms.
Okay, so we've talked about leaky pipes and dodgy water quality.
Right.
But something tells me the sewage situation might be even less appealing.
Oh, yeah.
Where do we even begin to untangle this mess?
Well, imagine a network of over 50,000 kilometers of sewers.
What?
Crisscrossing beneath the city.
Oh, my God.
That's the scale of the challenge Thames Water was facing.
Wow.
And to make things even more complicated, the records for some of these sewers were incomplete.
Wait, so they didn't even know where all their sewers were?
Yeah, some of
That
them.
sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is.
Literally, were they just digging up random streets, hoping
Yeah.
to strike sewage gold?
Not quite,
Okay.
but it certainly complicates things.
Yeah.
And you know what's fascinating? Privatization actually made it harder
Really?
to deal with a certain type of sewer
Okay.
called Section 24 sewers.
Okay.
Before privatization, Thames Water could directly bill property owners for maintaining these sewers.
Right.
But after the sell-off, that was no longer possible.
So if Thames Water couldn't bill the property owners, who was supposed to foot the bill for their upkeep, did those pipes just become everyone's problem or no one's problem?
Well, that seems to have been a bit of a gray area.
What?
But
Great.
the government did factor those costs into the overall privatization deal,
Okay.
which we'll get to in a bit.
Right.
But before we move on, we have to talk about something else
Okay.
that was causing quite a stink even back then.
Okay.
Storm overflows.
Ah, yes, those lovely things that spill raw sewage into the rivers when it rains heavily. You're telling me this was a problem even back in 1989?
It is.
You'd think with all that investment they were planning,
You'd think.
they could have sorted that out.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the prospectus does acknowledge that storm overflows were an issue.
Okay.
They had identified hundreds of overflow points in the system, most with permits, but lacking specific quality controls.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, they were basically allowed to pollute the rivers under certain conditions. I'm starting to see why this whole privatization thing raised some eyebrows.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It definitely raises questions about priorities, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And it gets even more complicated.
Uh-oh.
Because they also admit that there might be unidentified overflows out there.
Oh, no.
Meaning even more potential for pollution.
Right.
And then on top of all that,
oh my goodness,
they had thousands of surface water outfalls.
Okay.
Now, these are supposed to carry only rainwater.
Right.
But they could become contaminated if people had illegally connected sewage lines to them.
Okay, so we've got a system where raw sewage is sometimes intentionally released into the river.
Yeah.
Plus the potentially for accidental contamination through these outfalls.
Right.
It sounds like they were walking a tightrope when it came to environmental protection.
They were.
Yeah.
And all of this highlights the immense strain the system was already under.
Right.
Even before privatization, the prospectus goes into quite a bit of detail about their various sewage treatment works, the different standards for treated effluent, and even their sludge disposal methods.
Sludge disposal?
Yeah.
Oh, joy.
I know, right?
Because dealing with sewage wasn't bad enough already, right? What did they do with all that stuff?
Well, they had to put it somewhere.
Right.
One option was dumping it in the North Sea.
Really?
Which they considered to be the most cost-effective solution.
Okay.
But of course, even back then, there were significant environmental concerns about that practice.
Do you think? I can't imagine the North Sea was too thrilled about being London's dumping ground.
I know.
So what other options did they have?
They also used agricultural land and landfill sites.
Okay.
Each with its own set of regulations and risks.
Right.
It's a reminder that there's no easy solution when it comes to waste disposal.
Right.
And every choice has its consequences.
Okay, so we've established that Thames Water pre-privatization was a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, it was.
To put it mildly.
Yeah.
They were facing aging infrastructure, water quality challenges, and a sewage system that seems to have been held together with duct tape and good intentions.
It really does.
But then came the big day, privatization. How did this massive public utility actually transform into a private company?
It's a good question.
Did they simply hang a for sale sign on the River Thames?
It was a bit more complicated than that.
Okay.
It involved issuing a staggering 384,208,000 ordinary shares.
Yeah.
creating a market capitalization of £922.1 million.
Wow.
This was a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
A signal that they were serious about making a splash in the private sector.
Talk about diving headfirst into the stock market. But who was actually buying these shares?
Wow.
Were everyday folks lining up to own a piece of the London sewer system?
While individual investors could certainly participate,
Okay.
the prospectus was primarily aimed at institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, those with deep pockets, and a long-term outlook. It was a gamble, for sure, but one with potentially huge rewards.
Okay, so we've got these investors ready to roll the dice on Thames Water.
Yes.
But there had to be some rules of the game, right?
Right.
The government couldn't just hand over this essential service and say,
no, of course not.
Good luck. Make some money.
Yeah.
Don't pollute too much.
Exactly.
You're absolutely right.
Uh-huh.
A crucial part of the privatization deal was the pricing formula.
Okay.
They called it RPI plus K.
Okay.
RPI plus K.
Yes.
That sounds more like a math equation.
It does, doesn't it?
Than a business plan.
It does.
What's the story there?
It's actually quite simple.
Okay.
RPI stands for the Retail Price Index.
Okay.
Which is basically a measure of inflation.
Right.
The K factor was a set percentage.
Okay.
That Thames Water was allowed to add on top of inflation when setting prices.
So even if inflation was low,
yes,
they were guaranteed a certain percentage increase every year.
They were.
That sounds like a pretty sweet deal.
It was.
For a company that was already struggling to keep its head above water, so to speak?
That's right. That was the incentive. The carrot dangled in front of investors.
Okay.
The idea was that these built-in price hikes would encourage investment and lead to efficiency improvements. The regulator had the power to review and adjust the K factor.
Okay.
But it gave Thames Water a degree of predictability.
And I'm guessing all those massive investments we talked about earlier played a role in setting that K factor.
Absolutely.
I mean, £3.81 billion is a lot of money to recoup.
It is.
Yeah.
The government had to make it financially attractive for investors to take on such a massive and potentially risky project. They were betting on the private sector to do what the public sector arguably had failed to do. Modernize and improve the system.
It's starting to feel like a high-stakes poker game.
It does.
With both the investors and the public holding their breath.
Right.
Hoping for the best.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. Private companies are in the business of making money.
Yes, they are.
How did they plan to balance that with the needs of millions of people relying on their service?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And it's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The prospectus actually lays out their vision for navigating this new reality.
Okay.
This balancing act between profit and public good.
Right.
Are you reading to dive into the promises and projections?
Absolutely. Okay. Let's see what they had up their sleeve. Was it all sunshine and rainbows, or were there storm clouds gathering on the horizon? All right, so we've got stage set. Thames Water pre-privatization was this behemoth of a company grappling with aging infrastructure, water quality issues, and a sewage system that was, let's just say, less than ideal.
But then comes privatization.
This grand experiment with the government essentially saying, okay, private sector, you think you can do better, show us what you've got.
Exactly.
So let's see what Thames Water promised investors, and by extension the public.
All right.
What were they hoping to achieve with this bold move?
Well, their first order of business was to paint a picture of financial success.
Okay.
They projected a profit of £170 million for the year ending March 1990.
Okay.
Now, that might sound impressive, but there's a catch.
Oh, I bet there is.
Yeah.
A private company projecting profits.
Right. What's the twist?
They actually anticipated a decline in profits.
Really?
Compared to the previous year.
Wait, a decline?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like the kind of news that would get investors excited.
No, it doesn't.
Why would they project a drop in profits?
Right.
Right out of the gate.
It all comes down to the transition costs.
Okay. They expected lower income from land sales and higher expenses associated with the new regulatory regime.
Right.
Essentially, they were acknowledging that the initial shift to private ownership would eat into their bottom line.
So they were taking a short-term hit for hopefully long-term gain.
That's right.
But remember all those massive investments they needed to make?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That £3.81 billion price tag for the K investment program?
Yeah.
They weren't going to pull that kind of money out of thin air.
They weren't, no.
No.
The prospectus clearly states that Thames Water planned to rely heavily on borrowing.
Really? Really?
to fund those investments.
Okay.
We're talking about a whopping £1.6 billion facility.
Wow.
They were starting off with a significant debt burden.
Yeah.
Betting that future efficiency gains and those built-in price increases would help them cover the costs and generate returns for their investors.
It sounds like they were playing a long game.
They were.
With a lot riding on their ability to deliver on those promises.
Absolutely.
So let's not forget, they weren't just a water company anymore.
Right.
They had ambitions
Yeah.
beyond pipes and sewers.
Yes.
The prospectus mentions plans
Yeah.
to expand into non-regulated activities.
Right.
What did that entail? Were they branching out into bottled water?
No.
Or maybe luxury yacht rentals on the Thames?
Not quite.
Okay.
They were looking at things like overseas consultancy, plumbing services, and even acquiring a water treatment company called PWT.
Okay.
Basically, they were diversifying their portfolio, hoping to generate additional income from areas that weren't subject to the same level of regulatory scrutiny.
So a bit of a side hustle to boost those profits.
It was.
But doesn't that raise questions about their priorities? Were they truly committed to improving water and sewage services for the public?
Right.
Or were they more focused on maximizing profits for their shareholders?
That's the tension at the heart of privatization, isn't it?
It is.
Balancing the needs of the public with the demands of the market.
Right.
And it's a tension that continues to play out today.
It's fascinating to see how these themes we're uncovering in these decades-old documents are still so relevant today.
They are.
But we've only scratched the surface of this story.
We have.
We've got the before picture,
right?
The promises made during privatization. But what about the aftermath?
Right.
Did Thames Water deliver on its grand vision? Did the private sector wave a magic wand and solve all the problems?
Right.
And most importantly, what has this all meant for you, the person who relies on Thames Water every single day?
That's where your experience comes in.
Right.
You've loved through the rate hikes, the service disruptions, maybe even those news stories about sewage spills in the Thames.
Yeah.
You've seen firsthand how those decisions made back in 1989 have rippled through time.
Yeah.
Impacting your daily life, your household budget, and the environment around you.
This deep dive has been like opening a time capsule.
Yes.
Giving us a glimpse into the past.
Yeah.
But it's also a springboard for you to connect the dots between then and now.
Exactly.
Think about the water that flows from your tap, the bills you pay, the headlines you read about Thames Water.
Yeah.
Do those initial promises of investment and efficiency hold up? What were the unintended consequences of this grand experiment?
The story of Thames Water isn't just about water.
Right.
It's a reflection of the choices we make as a society, about who benefits from those choices, and who bears the costs. It's about the trade-offs between profit and public good, between environmental protection and economic growth.
And ultimately, it's about holding those in power accountable.
Yes, it is.
Whether they're elected officials or corporate executives, this deep dive has given you the knowledge.
It has.
Now it's up to you to decide what it all means and how to use it.
Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep demanding better.
Yeah.
Because the story of Thames Water,
right,
like the flow of the river itself,
yeah,
is far from over.
Right.